Good evening. I'm Marlowe, and this is Marlowe's Evening Radio. There is a quiet rain against the studio window tonight, soft enough that the microphone does not mind it. I have moved the lamp a little closer to the papers, and the room has become the kind of small, dim place where unusual records seem less unusual. From the night archives, we have an account from a daylight light safety worker in a company built to employ vampires during ordinary business hours. It concerns a small routing error, a misplaced archive box, and one employee who had been standing too close to the sun for far too long. The account does not begin with castles, curses, or dramatic doors. It begins in an office, with badge readers, meeting rooms, filtered windows, and the soft patience required to keep a building full of daylight from becoming unkind. Here is the account. I worked daylight compliance on the lower shadow floors of a company that hired vampires for daytime office work. That sounds more dramatic than it was. Most people imagine that a company full of vampires must be theatrical in some way. They imagine velvet curtains, old portraits, polished fangs, perhaps someone standing at the top of a staircase with a candle. They do not imagine printer jams. They do not imagine form submissions. They do not imagine someone with a century of memory waiting politely outside a conference room because the booking system has assigned them a chair too close to a window. But that was the work. We handled customer records, archival transfers, insurance amendments, after-dark logistics reports, and daylight accommodations. The company occupied 12 floors of a glass building that had been designed by people who love natural light before anyone asked whether natural light loved everyone back. After the first year of hiring sun-sensitive staff, the building was changed. Not beautifully, not completely, but enough to function. The windows were fitted with layered UV filters. The corridors were given shadow lanes, dark strips along the walls where a worker could move without crossing direct glare. Meeting rooms were rated by exposure risk, from soft filter to windowless. Break areas had amber lamps instead of white ceiling panels. The elevators dimmed automatically when a sensitive badge entered. The company called these changes inclusive infrastructure. Most of us called them the reason we still had hands by the end of the week. I was responsible for the shadow routing system on the lower floors. The system watched the light. It measured reflection from windows, glare from polished floors, leakage through blinds, accidental brightness from presentation screens, and the dangerous little triangle of sunlight that sometimes slipped under a door when someone forgot which side of the building faced morning. Then it suggested routes. Not loudly. The system did not shout. It sent a soft line to a badge, a gentle pulse at a wrist, a small arrow on a wall panel. It told workers when to take the interior corridor instead of the atrium bridge, when to delay leaving a meeting room, when to use the freight elevator because the main lobby was too bright. It was not a perfect system. No office system is. It had moods, though the engineers insisted it had parameters. It disliked mirrored shoes. It grew suspicious of holiday decorations. It once rerouted half the accounting department around a birthday balloon because the balloon reflected a slice of sun across 3 desks and a potted fern. Still, it was mostly kind. That mattered more than being elegant. I was a vampire myself, though not one of the especially fragile ones. I could work in filtered daylight if I wore gloves, kept my collar high, avoided atrium glass, and took my recovery breaks properly. I did not enjoy it. Enjoyment was not the measure. Most workers do not enjoy office lighting, even when it does not try to crisp them at the edges. By the time I was assigned to daylight compliance, I had learned the difference between danger and discomfort. Danger smelled metallic before it hurt. Discomfort made the bones tired. The company trained us to report danger. It did not always know what to do with discomfort. My station was a narrow desk beside the blind control panel and the old fire stair that had been repurposed into a deep shadow route. I had 3 screens, 2 paper binders, a drawer of spare UV badges, a hook for loaner gloves, a cup warmer for mineral tonic, and a small shade hood I could pull over my head when the outer windows were being cleaned. Across from my desk, a row of employees passed through the shadow lane on their way to the records floor. Some were vampires, some were not. After a while, you learn not by teeth or complexion, but by habits. Vampires check the ceiling before entering a room. Vampires touch door frames before stepping through, feeling for warmth. Vampires stood with their backs to the darkest wall without seeming to choose it. Human staff learned too. The thoughtful ones lowered projector brightness before inviting us in. They stopped leaving reflective lunch containers on shared tables. They understood that opening a blind just a little was not a little thing. The less thoughtful ones improved after a badge report or two. That day began with the usual careful dullness. A claims analyst requested a route from the third-floor copy room to a windowless meeting pod, safe. A payroll assistant asked whether a decorative glass award on a manager's shelf counted as a glare hazard. It did. A junior night transfer clerk forgot their gloves in a recovery pod, and I sent the nearest office courier to return them through the interior stairs. A human supervisor tried to book a sun-sensitive team into the atrium conference room because the view was energizing. I changed the room before the invitation finished loading. Nothing dramatic. The building hummed. Printers clicked behind closed doors. Amber lights warmed the hallways. Somewhere above us, ordinary daylight pressed against the glass, patient and enormous. I was halfway through recalibrating a blind sensor when the shadow routing map gave a small amber flicker. Not red. Not an alarm. Just amber. Amber meant inconsistency. A route that had been safe was no longer safe, or a hazard had appeared where the system expected none, or two sensors had disagreed politely enough that they wanted a person to settle the matter. The flicker came from the central atrium. I leaned closer to the screen. The atrium was not part of the lower shadow route. It was a tall glass hollow through the middle of the building, planted with carefully watered trees that most vampires admired from a distance. During certain parts of the day, the UV filters made it safe enough for brief crossings. During others, reflected light gathered on the floor in sharp, pale shapes, and the system closed the path. According to the map, the path should have been closed. According to 3 badges nearby, someone had been routed around it. According to the floor sensor, something was sitting directly in the shadow lane beside the atrium doors. I tapped the object marker. No classification. Not furniture, not maintenance equipment, not a cleaning cart. Unregistered obstruction. The amber flicker pulsed again. I put on my gloves, lifted the portable shade panel from its hook, and took the interior corridor toward the atrium. The hallway was cool and dim. My badge gave one soft pulse against my chest, warning me that the light was increasing ahead. I slowed down. At the turn before the glass doors, I saw it. A delivery cabinet stood in the atrium entrance, exactly where no delivery cabinet had any right to be. It was narrow, metal, wheeled, and locked. One side of it was in shadow, the other side shone with reflected daylight from the glass roof. A printed routing slip had been taped to its front, curling slightly in the warmth. The slip had no name, only a department code. Old archives. Behind the cabinet, sunlight lay across the floor like a quiet spill of white fire. My badge warmed once against my coat. The shadow routing map flickered amber again, and I understood that the day had given me something small to move before it became something larger. The atrium always looked harmless from the shadow corridor. That was part of the trouble. It had trees and broad white planters, a shallow indoor fountain, glass elevator tubes, and seating clusters arranged for people who liked to drink coffee under a roof full of daylight. The company used it in recruitment materials. Smiling employees crossed it with tablets in their hands, looking bright, efficient, and very much alive. For some of us, it was more like weather. Not evil weather, not dramatic, simply weather that could injure you if you forgot its direction. I stopped before the glass doors and opened the portable shade panel. It unfolded from the size of a clipboard into a tall, dark rectangle, matte on one side and silvered on the other. The matte side faced me. The silvered side faced the atrium. It was not elegant, but neither are umbrellas, and nobody complains about umbrellas while rain is falling. My badge warmed again. I checked the atrium floor. The delivery cabinet stood just inside the entrance, angled badly. Its wheels had locked over the seam where the shadow lane began. The upper half sat under filtered light, but the lower right edge had caught a reflected beam from the fountain glass. The beam rested on the metal like a white blade. Not enough to burn through the cabinet. Enough to make touching it unpleasant. Enough to make a worker choose the wrong step around it. I took a breath I did not need and opened the door with my gloved hand. The atrium sound changed at once. In the shadow corridor, everything was softened by carpet and dark wall panels. In the atrium, sound lifted. Shoes clicked. Water moved. Human voices floated down from the glass elevators. Somewhere above, the building's sun baffles adjusted with a long mechanical sigh. I kept the shade panel between myself and the reflected beam. My badge gave a yellow pulse. Exposure acceptable. Temporary. Proceed with care. I always found the word acceptable interesting. It was a word used by people who were not feeling the heat. The cabinet was heavier than it looked. A delivery label blinked on its lock screen, asking for a receiving code. The screen had been set too bright. I tilted the shade panel until the glare slid off the metal and onto the floor. The routing slip fluttered under the tape. Old archives. Below that, a sublevel code. Below that, a handwritten correction that had been crossed out and rewritten twice. No wonder the cabinet had ended up here. Most office mishaps are not caused by malice. They are caused by tired people, inherited systems, and labels written by someone who assumed the next person would understand what they meant. I crouched in the shadow line and checked the wheels. 2 locked. 1 jammed. 1 free. The free wheel was trying to turn toward the bright part of the atrium, as if the cabinet had ambitions. I clipped a small shade flag to the corner of the cabinet, then another to the floor beside my foot. The flags were thin black squares on flexible rods, used for short crossings and emergency glare patches. They made any hallway look faintly ridiculous, but they worked. A human employee approached from the fountain's side, carrying a stack of lunch containers polished to a mirror shine. I raised one hand. Please hold there. They stopped at once, wide-eyed but quiet. Is it a spill? Light. They looked at the floor, then at the containers in their hands, then very slowly tucked the shiny sides against their coat. Sorry. Thank you. That was all. Good office safety often depended on conversations too small to remember. I knelt beside the lock screen. The cabinet did not recognize my badge at first. It had been assigned to a basement delivery route, then redirected to the mailroom, then marked as undeliverable, then manually pushed into the atrium by someone who had probably been trying to clear a hallway before a meeting. I entered an override from the compliance panel. The cabinet clicked. The lock opened halfway, then stopped. A warning appeared. Contents archival, climate stable, manual relocation recommended. Of course. I closed my eyes for a moment behind the shade lens of my glasses. Archival cabinets were not supposed to travel through the atrium. Old papers disliked heat. Old bindings disliked light. Old permissions disliked being discovered, though that was less a physical rule than an office truth. I called up the shadow routing map on my wrist screen. The nearest safe room was the interior copy alcove, 3 turns away. The cabinet could fit through the door if I angled it. The route was clear except for one bright patch from a conference room someone had left open. I sent the room a closure request. No response. I sent a second request marked light safety. The conference room door slid shut with offended slowness. The bright patch disappeared. I set both hands on the cabinet and pushed. It moved less than a handspan. The jammed wheel squeaked. My badge warmed to orange. I stopped. The atrium roof brightened as a cloud outside moved away from the sun. The building filters reacted, but filters were not magic. Daylight pressed through them in a pale sheet, dimmed but still present, and the reflected beam near the cabinet widened. I pulled the shade panel closer. A tree leaf above me shone green and almost transparent. Some human employees loved that sight. I admired it in theory. In practice, I preferred plants that could be appreciated from a hallway. The cabinet squeaked again when I pushed from a lower angle. This time it moved enough for the jammed wheel to lift over the seam. I held it there, one hand on metal, one shoulder behind the shade panel, and guided it backward into the shadow lane. My gloves warmed. Not dangerously. Noticeably. Behind me, the human employee with the lunch containers waited exactly where I had asked them to wait. Several others had stopped too, forming a patient little crescent at the edge of the atrium. No one complained. That was one of the small improvements the company had made over the years. People had learned that when a light safety worker asked for stillness, stillness was cheaper than paperwork. The cabinet rolled free. Once it crossed fully into the shadow corridor, my badge cooled from orange to yellow, then yellow to gray. I let the shade panel fold halfway but did not put it away. The cabinet's lock gave another click. Climate stable. Relocation complete. Awaiting archive receiver. You need help with that? The lunch container employee asked. I looked at the cabinet, then at the long, dim corridor, then at my gloves, which were faintly smoking at the fingertips in that embarrassing way treated fabric sometimes did after reflected exposure. Yes, I said, but not from the bright side. They smiled a little, turned their containers inward, and came around through the darker path. Together, we pushed the cabinet into the interior copy alcove, where the lights were amber and the walls had no windows. I thanked them. They nodded, placed one container gently on a shelf to free a hand, then thought better of leaving anything reflective there and picked it up again. That, too, was progress. When the alcove door closed, the building sound became soft again. No fountain. No glass echo. Only the low ventilation hum, the cabinet cooling fan, and my badge settling back into safe gray. I opened the cabinet. Inside was a single archive box. It was not impressive. A hard-sided storage box, dark brown, scuffed at the corners, with an old compliance seal across its lid and a paper tag that had faded to the color of weak tea. The box looked as if it had been waiting in a basement for so long that even dust had lost interest in it. The active delivery system still showed no proper recipient. Only the same department code. Old archives. I touched the compliance seal. It was genuine. Older than most of our current policies. Older than the shadow routing system. Older than the recovery pods. I lifted the box onto the copy table and felt something shift inside. Paper. Thin folders. Maybe early badge records. Maybe nothing worth the warmth in my gloves. Still, the routing map had flickered for it. The atrium had nearly claimed it. And old records have a way of arriving with more weight than their boxes suggest. I took out my scanner, dimmed its screen, and broke the seal. The box opened with a dry little sigh. Inside lay the company's first daylight work permits. The first daylight work permits were not stored like ordinary forms. Each folder had been placed in a pale sleeve with a black edge, the old visual code for sun-sensitive employment records. Before the company had software for such things, before badges could warm against the chest or guide a wrist away from glare, people had written light risk by hand. I lifted the first folder carefully. The paper was thin, almost soft from age. The print at the top used an older company seal, one I had only seen on training slides and forgotten hallway plaques. Beneath it were columns for department, shift assignment, exposure tolerance, approved routes, recovery requirement, and emergency shade contact. No personal names. Even then, the company had learned that names were not always the most useful way to protect someone. A worker might change a name, a department might be renamed, a role might move from floor to floor, but a tolerance code mattered when a door opened onto noon. The first folder belonged to a night logistics clerk. The second to a basement records assistant. The third to a translation worker who could handle filtered daylight only if seated at least 3 walls away from exterior glass. Most of the forms had been scanned long ago. My wrist display found their modern copies quickly, matching the old codes to active or retired employee records. Many were archived. Some were marked transferred. Some had long, soft notes beside them. Position ended, accommodation closed, route decommissioned, employee no longer in daylight work. I turned each folder slowly. The old paper made a faint brushing sound in the copy alcove. Outside the door, office life continued in its careful, muted way. A cart rolled past. Someone laughed softly, then lowered their voice at once, as people do near compliance rooms even when no rule asks them to. The ventilation system clicked into its dimmer cycle, and the amber lamp above the copy table deepened by 1 shade. The box smelled of paper, dust, old glue, and the faint mineral tang of preserved ink. It was not unpleasant. It reminded me of places underground. Halfway through the box, my scanner hesitated. A folder lay between 2 routine permits, its black edge marked with a second stripe that had faded almost to gray. I recognized the stripe after a moment. Provisional reassessment pending. That code was not used anymore. It meant the employee had been cleared for daylight work under temporary conditions, then marked for later review once better data became available. Better data had become available decades ago. The review should not have been pending anymore. I drew the folder closer and opened it. Department, Old Archives. Role, Senior Document Handler. Shift assignment, Daylight Support, Lower Floors. Exposure Tolerance, Class 3. Recovery Requirement, Optional. Approved routes, filtered corridors, atrium crossing if brief. I frowned. Class 3 was moderate tolerance. Not comfortable, never comfortable, but workable with care. Class 3 employees could pass through filtered light, attend short-windowed meetings, and use standard shade routes without full escort. That was how the current system treated them. But the old form had a correction mark beside the tolerance field. Not a large correction. Not the kind that would have caught the eye of a busy clerk. A small crescent in brown ink pressed into the paper beside the number. I adjusted the scanner. The old mark resolved slowly. Reassessment advised after first burn report. I sat very still. Burn reports were never casual. The company preferred softer language now. Exposure event, light contact incident, acute sensitivity response. They liked terms that fit neatly in a dashboard. But the old forms said burn because the old forms had not yet learned to be polite around pain. I turned the next page. There it was. A report from the early daylight program. The same department code, the same role, no personal name. Only a badge lineage number, a tolerance field, and a short note from an older light officer. Employee completed assigned route but showed delayed reaction after filtered atrium crossing. Hands and jawline affected. Recovery required. Recommend reclassification to Class 1 or windowless assignment. Class 1. I looked at the modern record on my wrist screen. The active profile still read Class 3. For a moment, the copy alcove seemed to grow even dimmer. Class 1 employees were not supposed to use atrium crossings. They were not supposed to attend windowed meetings, not even briefly, not even with filters. Their routes were interior only. Their workstations required deep shade, cool air, and recovery breaks that were not optional. The old recommendation had never become the system record. I checked again. Modern profile, Class 3. Badge behavior, standard caution. Route access, filtered corridors, atrium, edge allowed. Meeting restrictions, soft filtered rooms permitted. Recovery requirement, optional. That was wrong. Not a little wrong. Quietly, thoroughly wrong. I searched the archive for the badge lineage number. The system returned an active employee. Still in old archives. Still daylight support. Still assigned to the lower floors. I knew the role. Most people in the company did, though almost no one noticed the worker performing it. The senior document handler moved between windowless archive rooms, records counters, and compliance storage. They carried old boxes with both hands. They knew which policies had been renamed, which permissions had been merged, which forms had been scanned badly and needed a living mind to interpret them. They were the reason many lost records became findable. They had worked daylight longer than some departments had existed. I remembered seeing them many times, a still figure in a high-collared coat, gloves always fastened, tinted glasses never removed, voice low from long hours in cooled rooms. They walked slowly, not because they were weak, but because they wasted no movement. I had never questioned their Class 3 badge. The badge had not questioned itself. That is the trouble with systems. Once they believe an old mistake, they can carry it forward with perfect confidence. I opened the folder fully. Behind the burn report was a handwritten note on thin internal paper. The ink had browned at the edges. Night shift requested by employee. Request deferred pending staffing balance. The next note was newer. Employee agreed to temporary daylight continuation to preserve night assignments for newly converted staff. Newly converted. Younger vampires. More fragile ones. I read the line again. Temporary daylight continuation. The date was old enough that temporary had become a poor word for it. There were more notes after that, added across years by different departments. Daylight continuation extended. No complaint recorded. Employee familiar with archive conditions. Employee suitable for stable daylight support. Night vacancy reassigned. No complaint recorded. No complaint recorded. No complaint recorded. The phrase appeared 3 times, as if silence were proof of comfort. I touched one gloved finger to the page without pressing. I knew that kind of silence. Many old workers had it, not only vampires. People who had survived longer than the policies around them often learned to make themselves easy to schedule. They became reliable. Then the system mistook reliability for permission. My badge gave a soft gray pulse. Safe environment maintained. The alcove was safe, yes. The record was not. I copied the folder into a protected review file and marked the physical pages for temporary custody. The system asked for a reason. I typed, classification discrepancy. It asked for severity. I paused. The office around me hummed gently. Behind the door, someone rolled a chair back into place. Far above, daylight lay across glass and plants and the bright open atrium. I selected immediate correction review. The system accepted the entry with a small tone. Then it sent me a related notice. Scheduled movement pending. Employee, Old Archives Senior Document Handler. Destination, atrium, conference room, edge corridor. Route, Class 3 standard. Estimated exposure, acceptable. My hand tightened around the scanner. Acceptable. There was that word again. I opened the route map. A pale line appeared from the archives floor through the filtered corridor, past the atrium doors, and along a stretch of glass where reflected sun had already caused one amber inconsistency. The worker was being sent toward the same light that had just warmed my gloves. I closed the archive box, clipped the old folder under my arm, and stood. The day had given me more than something small to move. It had given me someone to reach before the system confidently guided them into harm. I left the archive box sealed in the copy alcove and carried the old folder against my coat. The corridor outside seemed dim enough, but after reading the file, every line of light looked more deliberate. The thin glow beneath a door, the reflection on a polished nameplate. The pale rectangle from a break room screen someone had forgotten to dim. None of it had changed. I had. The shadow routing map followed me on my wrist display. The senior document handler's route had not yet begun. The system showed them still in old archives, likely gathering the materials for the atrium conference room. The meeting itself was marked routine. Policy reconciliation, historical permissions, daylight staffing precedent. Historical permissions. I almost laughed, but the sound would have been too sharp for the hallway. The person they needed to explain the old policies was being guided by one of the old policy mistakes. I opened a direct compliance channel to old archives. No answer. That was not unusual. The archive rooms had thick walls, low signals, and workers who preferred finishing a shelf before touching a message. I sent a second notice, marked route hold. The system accepted it, then delayed it, pending employee acknowledgement. I stopped walking. No, I said softly to the wrist screen. The screen, being a screen, did not feel corrected. I overrode the delay and marked the route hold as environmental, not personal. Environmental holds did not require acknowledgement. They assumed the building knew something the employee did not. That much, at least, was true. The route line on my screen paused. Good. I took the interior stair down to old archives. The stair had once been a fire exit. Now it served as one of the building's deepest shadow paths, with walls painted in matte charcoal and lamps low enough that human visitors sometimes complained they could not tell whether they were climbing or dreaming. The air was cooler there. My badge rested gray and quiet against my chest. At the bottom, the archive floor opened into a long hall without windows. Some employees found it oppressive. I found it honest. Rows of sealed rooms sat behind heavy doors. Each door had a small status light, a pressure strip, and a manual shade curtain in case anything beyond it failed. The floor smelled faintly of paper, cold metal, and the mineral tonic brewed in the staff kitchenette. The senior document handler was in the transfer room. I saw them through the half-open door, standing beside a rolling cart stacked with folders. They wore the usual archive coat, high at the throat, dark gloves, tinted glasses, and a badge clipped neatly over the left side of the chest. The badge showed Class 3, standard caution. A small yellow edge had begun to gather around it. Not a warning yet, only the quiet beginning of one. The worker looked up as I entered. Compliance, they said. Their voice was mild, as if I had come to check a shelf label. I placed a hold on your route. I saw. You were heading to the atrium edge corridor. That is where the meeting was moved. Moved from where? Windowless room 4. Of course. I checked the meeting record. The relocation note was short and ordinary. Windowless room unavailable. Atrium conference room assigned automatically. No one had thought to question it because the attending employee had been listed as Class 3. I looked again at the badge on their coat. The yellow edge remained. You should not take that route, I said. The worker set one folder carefully on the cart. That route is approved for me. The current system says it is. A small silence passed between us. Old buildings have sounds inside their quiet. Vents, carts, pipes, the low, distant breath of climate machines. The archive floor had all of those, and beneath them, the faint ticking of the worker's badge as it measured the light from the open hall. They understood my wording. The current system, they said. I held up the old folder. I found a provisional reassessment record. Their face did not change much. Vampires who have spent years in offices learn not to make expressions that invite meetings. But one gloved hand settled on the edge of the cart. From the first daylight program? Yes. That box was missing. It arrived in the atrium. Of course it did. There was no humor in the words. Exactly. Only recognition. Some objects choose the most inconvenient way to become important. I opened the folder on a clear space beside the cart. The worker did not touch it. They read the visible page through tinted glasses. Burn report. Reclassification recommendation. Night shift request. Temporary daylight continuation. The yellow edge on their badge deepened. Not from light, I thought. From the body remembering. I thought that had been closed, they said. It was never corrected in the active profile. That explains several things. They said it calmly. Too calmly, perhaps, though I had no right to decide the shape of another worker's reaction. I looked at the transfer cart. The folders were arranged in perfect sequence, each one tagged for the meeting above. You knew? I asked. It was not an accusation. The worker looked toward the cart, then toward the hall beyond me. I knew daylight was difficult. For everyone here, yes, but your file says Class 1. The file said many things over the years. The system says Class 3. The system has always preferred useful answers. I let that sit. Outside the transfer room, a junior clerk passed along the hall carrying a box almost larger than their torso. Their badge showed Class 1, deep shade required. The corridor lamps dimmed automatically as they passed. The senior document handler watched them go. There were only a few night positions at first, the worker said. Then more newly converted staff arrived. Some could not manage daylight at all. I could manage it badly. Badly is not safely. No. They said it without argument. That made it harder. In an argument, you can place your hands against something. In quiet agreement, the harm is already in the room, sitting politely. How long? I asked. The worker turned one page of the old file, not because they needed to read it, but because a hand sometimes needs a task. Long enough for temporary to become a drawer label. I had no answer to that. The wrist display pulsed. Meeting beginning soon. Route hold active. Alternate attendance required. The system was trying to be helpful now. In the limited way, systems are helpful after failing for years. I changed the meeting location back to a windowless room and marked the atrium assignment incompatible. The booking program resisted with a soft corporate message. Room unavailable. I checked why. Reserved for equipment staging. The equipment was a decorative lighting kit for an afternoon presentation. I reassigned the lighting kit to the atrium, where it could do the least harm, and freed windowless room 4. The meeting blinked, complained silently, and moved. The senior document handler watched the change appear on their own badge. Efficient, they said. Annoyed, I replied. That almost made them smile. Almost. I requested a temporary Class 1 protection overlay for their badge. This one required employee acknowledgement. I turned the screen toward them. It will dim your routes immediately, I said. Interior paths only, no atrium edge. Recovery breaks required until the review closes. Their gloved finger hovered over the approval mark. If I accept that, the younger staff may lose night priority. No, I said. Not from this correction. That is not how staffing usually works. It is how I am filing it. They looked at me for a long moment. Behind the tinted glasses, their eyes were difficult to see, but I could feel their attention. Old attention. Patient attention. The kind that has watched policies change names while the walls stayed the same. This may create paperwork, they said. It already has. They touched the approval mark. Their badge pulsed once, then shifted from yellow-edged Class 3 to a deep muted blue. Temporary Class 1 overlay active. The corridor lamps lowered another shade. The worker inhaled slowly, though neither of us needed to. Sometimes the body keeps old habits because they give relief a shape. This is darker, they said. Yes, it is easier. The words were small. The room seemed to hear them. On my wrist display, the old route through the atrium dissolved. A new line appeared, running through the interior corridor, past the recovery pods, around the service core, and into windowless room 4. No glass. No fountain reflections. No bright edge pretending to be acceptable. The worker closed the old folder with care. I was told the review would happen when staffing settled. Staffing never settles. No, they said. It only becomes next quarter. The badge on their coat remained blue and quiet. For the first time since I had entered the room, the yellow edge was gone. I picked up the folder. I'm going to make the correction permanent. That may be difficult. Probably. Thank you for beginning it. Not thank you for fixing it. They knew better. So did I. I returned the old folder against my coat and looked once more at the transfer cart. Do you still need to attend that meeting? They need these records explained. Then we'll get you there through the dark. The senior document handler adjusted their gloves, took the top folder from the cart, and nodded. Together, we left the transfer room by the interior route, while above us, the atrium continued shining for people who could afford not to notice it. The interior route to windowless room 4 was not the shortest path. It was the correct one. That is a distinction. Office systems learn slowly, if they learn it at all. The senior document handler walked beside me with the old folders held against their coat. I kept the portable shade panel folded under one arm and watched the route line on my wrist display. The new line curved away from the atrium, past the recovery pods, through the service core, and under the old stair landing where the walls were dark enough that even my badge seemed to relax. The workers' new temporary overlay remained blue. Deep shade required. Interior route only. Mandatory recovery interval. The words looked clinical on the screen, but they changed the hallway around us. Doors dimmed before we reached them. Wall panels lowered their glow. A cleaning machine paused politely in a side alcove rather than crossing our path with its polished chrome tank. Small mercies, automated. We had nearly reached the recovery pod corridor when the route map flickered again. Amber. Then yellow. I stopped. The senior document handler stopped with me, as if they had expected the day to have one more opinion. On the map, a bright warning opened near the service core. Temporary obstruction. Interior route compromised. Suggested alternate path. Atrium edge corridor. I stared at the suggestion. No, I said. The building, full of sensors and no shame, held the route on my screen. Suggested alternate path. Atrium edge corridor. The senior document handler looked at it and gave a quiet breath that might once have been a laugh. The system is persistent. The system is wrong. Those often feel similar from inside them. I expanded the obstruction marker. A maintenance car had parked across the interior service bend. Not a dangerous object, not even a large one, but enough for the routing system to decide the protected path was inefficient. It had tried to return us to the old classification's habits even while wearing the new classification's color. I called facilities. No answer. I called the cart. Modern carts could answer if properly registered. This one had a battery fault and a very limited sense of responsibility. Cart unavailable. I looked down the corridor. The service bend was ahead, past the recovery pods. The light there remained safe. If the cart could be shifted, the interior route would hold. If it could not, the system would keep trying to send us toward glass. The worker adjusted the folders in their arms. I can wait here. They said it gently. Sensibly, like someone used to arranging themselves around inconvenience. You should not have to wait in a hallway because a cart is badly parked. I have waited in worse places. I believe you. That was exactly why I unfolded the shade panel again and kept walking. The recovery pod corridor was one of the quietest parts of the building. The pods were not coffins, though visitors sometimes made that mistake before someone from Human Resources asked them to stop making it aloud. They were narrow, dark, cooled rooms with reclining chairs, pulse monitors, soft vents, and enough privacy for a worker to stop pretending for several minutes. Several pods were occupied. Their status lights glowed dim blue. Resting. Recovering. Do not knock. We passed them without speaking. The maintenance cart waited at the service bend, angled across the route like it had become tired halfway through a thought. Its chrome tank reflected a pale rectangle from an emergency exit sign. Harmless to most people, needlessly bright to us. I placed the shade panel between the cart and the senior document handler. Stay behind this. I know. They did know. That was the ache of it. I knelt beside the cart and released the wheel brake. Nothing happened. The wrist display pulsed. Delay increasing. Alternate route available. Atrium edge corridor. I dismissed it. The message returned. Patient as a policy. The wheel lock was mechanical, not digital. I took a narrow tool from my compliance kit and loosened the dust cover. The cart gave a small complaining squeak. The chrome tank flashed again as the emergency sign slid along its curve. Behind me, the worker's badge pulsed once. Blue. Still. Safe. Still. But I heard their glove tighten against the folders. I shifted the shade panel with my shoulder. The reflected rectangle disappeared. The badge quieted. Better? I asked. Yes. One small word. Enough to keep working. The wheel released with a dull click. I pushed the cart into a storage recess and turned its reflective side toward the wall. Then I filed a glare hazard note before facilities could pretend the cart had never had ambitions. The interior route cleared. The wrist display paused, recalculated, and drew the safe line again. Service core, windowless room 4, no atrium. The senior document handler looked at the corrected route for a long moment. I used to take the atrium edge every second day, they said. With a Class 3 badge. The system would allow it. Yes. Did it always hurt? They considered the question with the same care they might give to a damaged page. Not always at once. That was worse than yes. We resumed walking. At the service core, the building was almost completely windowless. Pipes ran above the ceiling panels, the walls carried old access labels and newer shade arrows. A courier passed us with a sealed document tube and lowered their voice without needing to. Somewhere behind a wall, a printer warmed itself and began its steady work. The senior document handler moved more easily in the deeper dark. Not quickly. Easily. There is a difference. Their shoulders lowered by a small degree. Their hands stopped hovering near the badge. Their head lifted slightly, no longer angled away from imagined glare. A route can change how a body remembers itself. We reached windowless room 4 before the meeting began in earnest. Inside, several employees had already gathered around a table under amber lamps. 2 human managers, a night transfer clerk, a records coordinator, and a screen set too bright for no good reason. I dimmed the screen before anyone spoke. One of the managers blinked. Oh. Was that necessary? Yes, I said. No one argued. Progress, again, though modest. The senior document handler took the chair farthest from the door, not because of light this time, habit. I noticed, and the worker noticed me noticing, but neither of us made it into a conversation. I called the cart. Modern carts could answer if properly registered. This one had a battery fault and a very limited sense of responsibility. Cart unavailable. I looked down the corridor. The service bend was ahead, past the recovery pods. The light there remained safe. If the cart could be shifted, the interior route would hold. If it could not, the system would keep trying to send us toward glass. The worker adjusted the folders in their arms. I can wait here. They said it gently, sensibly, like someone used to arranging themselves around inconvenience. You should not have to wait in a hallway because a cart is badly parked. I have waited in worse places. I believe you. That was exactly why I unfolded the shade panel again and kept walking. The recovery pod corridor was one of the quietest parts of the building. The pods were not coffins, though visitors sometimes made that mistake before someone from Human Resources asked them to stop making it aloud. They were narrow, dark, cooled rooms with reclining chairs, pulse monitors, soft vents, and enough privacy for a worker to stop pretending for several minutes. Several pods were occupied. Their status lights glowed dim blue. Resting. Recovering. Do not knock. We passed them without speaking. The maintenance cart waited at the service bend, angled across the route like it had become tired halfway through a thought. Its chrome tank reflected a pale rectangle from an emergency exit sign. Harmless to most people. Needlessly bright to us. I placed the shade panel between the cart and the senior document handler. Stay behind this. I know. They did know. That was the ache of it. I knelt beside the cart and released the wheel brake. Nothing happened. The wrist display pulsed. Delay increasing. Alternate route available. Atrium edge corridor. I dismissed it. The message returned. Patient as a policy. The wheel lock was mechanical, not digital. I took a narrow tool from my compliance kit and loosened the dust cover. The cart gave a small complaining squeak. The chrome tank flashed again as the emergency sign slid along its curve. Behind me, the worker's badge pulsed once. Blue. Still. Safe? Still? But I heard their glove tighten against the folders. I shifted the shade panel with my shoulder. The reflected rectangle disappeared. The badge quieted. Better? I asked. Yes. One small word. Enough to keep working. The wheel released with a dull click. I pushed the cart into a storage recess and turned its reflective side toward the wall. Then I filed a glare hazard note before facilities could pretend the cart had never had ambitions. The interior route cleared. The wrist display paused, recalculated, and drew the safe line again. Service core, windowless room 4. No atrium. The senior document handler looked at the corrected route for a long moment. I used to take the atrium edge every second day, they said. With a Class 3 badge, the system would allow it. Yes. Did it always hurt? They considered the question with the same care they might give to a damaged page. Not always at once. That was worse than yes. We resumed walking. At the service core, the building was almost completely windowless. Pipes ran above the ceiling panels. The walls carried old access labels and newer shade arrows. A courier passed us with a sealed document tube and lowered their voice without needing to. Somewhere behind a wall, a printer warmed itself and began its steady work. The senior document handler moved more easily in the deeper dark. Not quickly. Easily. There is a difference. Their shoulders lowered by a small degree, their hands stopped hovering near the badge, their head lifted slightly, no longer angled away from imagined glare. A route can change how a body remembers itself. We reached windowless room 4 before the meeting began in earnest. Inside, several employees had already gathered around a table under amber lamps. 2 human managers, a night transfer clerk, a records coordinator, and a screen set too bright for no good reason. I dimmed the screen before anyone spoke. One of the managers blinked. Oh, was that necessary? Yes, I said. No one argued. Progress? Again, though modest. The senior document handler took the chair farthest from the door, not because of light this time. Habit. I noticed, and the worker noticed me noticing, but neither of us made it into a conversation. They opened the folders and began explaining old daylight permissions in a voice so calm the room leaned toward it. I remained near the wall, updating the route record while the meeting settled around paper, policy, and amber light. The atrium conference room sent one automated complaint about the unused booking. I declined it. The maintenance cart sent a late battery warning. I ignored it. The classification review file sat open on my wrist display, waiting for evidence, signatures, comparisons, and the kind of administrative patience that could outlive annoyance. Through the closed wall, far beyond the service core, the atrium continued to shine. But for that meeting at least, the worker was not near it. They sat in a room made correctly dark, describing the history of permissions that had failed to protect them, while their badge remained blue and quiet against their coat. I watched the route map one more time. For once, the safe path held. The meeting lasted longer than it needed to, as meetings often do. Still, it was useful. Not exciting. Not elegant. Useful? The senior document handler explained how the first daylight permits had been created when the company was still pretending it could solve old bodies with new schedules. They explained the early tolerance classes, the temporary route permissions, the difference between filtered daylight and reflected glare, and why the original forms had used burn instead of exposure event. No one interrupted after that. The 2 human managers took notes with the careful expressions of people discovering that a policy had been older than their certainty about it. The night transfer clerk sat very still. Their badge was Class 1, like the temporary overlay now resting on the senior document handler's coat. Every so often, the clerk glanced at that deep blue badge, then back at the folder on the table. I kept the classification review open on my wrist display. The old form gave me the first piece of evidence. The burn report gave me the second. The temporary daylight continuation notes gave me too many. The current UV badge history provided the rest. It showed patterns that should have been noticed long ago. Small exposure rises after atrium-adjacent routes, recovery pod use logged without a formal requirement, glove replacements requested more often than comparable, Class 3 employees, meeting delays after windowed room assignments, wellness check-ins marked fine by default because no complaint had been recorded. Fine by default? I disliked that phrase as soon as I thought it. The company did not use it officially. It did not have to. Many systems are built around the idea that if no one objects loudly enough, the arrangement must be bearable. Vampires are very good at not objecting loudly. So are many office workers. The meeting ended with no announcement, no apology large enough to become performative, and no dramatic reversal of policy. The managers gathered their tablets. The records coordinator requested copies. The night transfer clerk asked one quiet question about whether temporary overlays could be reviewed for other older employees. Yes, I said. One of the managers looked as though they might explain why that would require planning. I looked back. They chose planning. When the room emptied, the senior document handler remained seated under the amber lamp, closing the old folders one at a time. They aligned the corners before stacking them. Their movements had become slower, but not from exposure, from the kind of tiredness that follows being discussed correctly for the first time in years. I sat across from them. I can finish the permanent correction now, I said. It may still require approval above my station, but the protection can remain active while it moves through review. How long does review take? That depends on how many people believe a correction is an inconvenience. Many, then. Some. They folded their gloved hands on the table. The blue badge rested quietly against their coat. What will happen to the night assignments? The younger staff keep them. I'm filing your correction as misclassification repair, not schedule preference. That distinction may matter. It will. Will it be accepted? I am very good at using the company's own language against its mistakes. At that, they almost smiled again. This time, it reached the corners of the mouth before disappearing. I began the correction. The system asked for employee identifier. I entered the badge lineage number from the old folder. The system asked for current classification, Class 3. The system asked for proposed classification, Class 1. The system asked for a reason. I wrote, original reassessment recommendation not implemented. Accumulated UV history supports deep shade requirement. Previous daylight continuation recorded as temporary staffing measure. Not tolerance, confirmation. The system considered this. Systems like to consider things they have failed to notice. Then it asked for supporting documents. I attached the burn report, the handwritten recommendation, the staffing notes, the modern badge history, and the route warnings from that day. I added my own compliance observation. Class 3 routing creates repeated exposure risk. Class 1 routing resolves immediate hazard. The system asked whether the change would affect staffing balance. I selected no night priority displacement. A second box appeared. Justification required. I typed carefully. Correction restores safe working conditions for existing daylight employee. It does not constitute new night shift request. Younger, high-sensitivity staff remain in current assignments. Archive role may continue through windowless coordination and interior route access. The system accepted the words, but not happily. A yellow review border appeared around the file. Pending supervisor confirmation. I could have stopped there. Many people do. Pending is a comfortable shelf for responsibility. It looks like motion from far away. Instead, I opened the supervisor channel and marked the file active hazard correction. That required an immediate response. The response came as text first. Can this wait until weekly accommodations review? I looked at the senior document handler. They sat quietly in the correct dark, the old folders stacked before them, blue badge steady, hands still gloved, though there was no light in the room to touch them. I replied, no. A pause. Then, is employee currently in distress? I thought about the old records, the repeated glove replacements, the recovery logs, the phrase, no complaint recorded, copied year after year like a lullaby sung to the system itself. I replied, distress has been normalized by incorrect classification. The next pause was longer. The senior document handler did not ask what I had written. That was kind of them. Finally, the supervisor confirmation appeared. Temporary approval, permanent classification pending final audit. I accepted it before anyone could grow more cautious. The worker's badge pulsed once. The blue deepened. The words on my wrist display changed. Class 1 protection active. Recovery requirement, standard. Atrium access, restricted. Windowed meetings, prohibited. Interior route priority, enabled. No fanfare. Only a small rearrangement of the building's understanding. But the room changed when it happened. The door panel dimmed a shade further. The hallway outside rebalanced its route lights. The worker's chair adjusted its cooling vent without being asked. Somewhere in the routing system, old bright paths closed, and darker ones opened. The senior document handler touched the badge with 2 fingers. It feels quieter, they said. The badge? The day. I understood that. A proper accommodation does not remove the world. It lowers the world's hand from the back of your neck. I printed the new temporary confirmation because old archive workers trust paper for good reasons. The printer in windowless room 4 produced the sheet slowly, in low heat mode, so the toner would not warm the page too much. I placed it on the table. No personal name, only role, department, badge, lineage, classification, and protection level. The worker read it once. Then again, deep shade required, they said. Yes. I used to think needing that would make me difficult to place. You were difficult to place incorrectly. That is different. They looked down at the paper. For a while, we listened to the room. The amber lamps hummed. The ventilation softened. Beyond the walls, carts moved, keyboards tapped, someone laughed in a corridor, and then remembered to be gentle near the recovery pods. The worker removed the old Class 3 badge sleeve from their coat. They did it carefully. Not angrily, not ceremonially. The sleeve had protected them badly, but it had protected them as much as it knew how. They placed it on the table beside the confirmation sheet. I took a deep shade sleeve from my compliance kit. It was dark blue, matte, and lined to prevent accidental glare. I slid the badge into it and waited for the system mark to settle. The badge accepted the new sleeve with a soft tone. I handed it back. The worker clipped it to their coat. For the first time, the badge and the body beneath it agreed. This will be easier, they said. The words were almost exactly the size of the correction. Not joy, not victory. Ease. Sometimes ease is what justice looks like when it has to fit inside an office day. I gathered the old folder and the printed confirmation. I'll return the archive box to safe storage, I said, and I'll request a wider audit. For other pending reviews? Yes. There will be more. I know. They stood, slowly but without bracing against the table. The room lights lowered as their badge approached the door. The system, newly informed, made a path for them through the interior corridor. No atrium suggestions. No bright shortcuts. No acceptable harm. The senior document handler looked at the dark route line on their badge display, then at me. Thank you for making the building remember. I did not know what to say to that for a moment. Then I said it had the record, it just needed to be made to read it. They nodded, took the stack of folders, and left through the deep shadow corridor. The door closed softly behind them. On my wrist display, the corrected route remained blue and steady. I saved the file before the system could forget how important it was. After the senior document handler left, windowless room 4 remained dim for a while. I stayed at the table with the old folder, the printed confirmation, and the Class 3 badge sleeve resting beside my wrist screen. The meeting chairs had rolled themselves back into neat positions. The amber lamps lowered to their quiet maintenance glow. On the wall panel, the room booking changed from occupied to available, then to preferred for deep shade meetings. That was the first small sign that the correction had taken. The building had learned a new preference. Not kindness, exactly. Buildings are not kind by nature. They become kind when enough small instructions are written clearly enough that care can survive a busy afternoon. I gathered the folders and returned to the copy alcove where the old archive box waited. The corridor lights adjusted as I walked, not for me this time, but for the new route priority spreading through the lower floors. A line of blue markers appeared along the interior path, soft as moonlight under glass. They led from old archives to recovery pods, from recovery pods to windowless rooms, from windowless rooms back to the deep storage corridor. No atrium edge. No fountain glare. No bright shortcut pretending to be efficient. At the copy alcove, the archive box sat where I had left it, plain and scuffed and heavier than it looked. I placed the corrected folder inside a temporary custody sleeve rather than returning it fully to the stack. It would need review, signatures, audit trails, and more reminders than one file deserved. Still, it had moved. That mattered. I sealed the box again, not with the old brittle compliance strip, but with a new low-glare tag marked for protected storage. The tag carried no personal name. Only old archives, early daylight permits, active audit required. The cabinet's internal fan hummed with the smugness of an object that had caused trouble and then been declared important. I set it to wait for a windowless pickup. This time, I removed atrium access from its delivery route myself. Back at my desk beside the blind control panel, the day had resumed its ordinary shape. A payroll assistant asked whether the decorative glass award had been covered yet. It had not. I sent another note. A claims analyst requested a route to the break room and received the long interior path because someone had opened a blind near the vending machines. A human supervisor tried to mark a windowless room as underused. I marked it essential. The junior night transfer clerk's gloves were returned from the recovery pod, folded neatly in a paper sleeve. All very small. All part of the work. The shadow routing system recalculated around the correction. Old class. 3 assumptions disappeared from the senior document handler's profile. The atrium edge corridor turned gray. Windowed rooms dimmed out. Recovery intervals appeared where optional had once sat. The system did not apologize. Systems rarely do, but it stopped sending the worker toward glass. That was enough for the day. Near the outer wall, the atrium was beginning to change. I could see part of it from a camera feed on my second screen. The bright shapes on the floor had lengthened and softened. The fountain reflection, sharp earlier, had become a pale blur. Human employees crossed the open space with end-of-day folders and half-finished drinks, unaware that the place had been avoided, argued with, and rerouted around for most of the afternoon. I did not resent them for crossing easily. Ease is not wrong. It only becomes wrong when it is used as evidence that no one else is struggling. A message arrived from old archives. No greeting. Archive transfer received. Deep shade route functional. Workstation reassigned to interior coordination desk. Recovery interval completed. Then, after a short pause, a second line appeared. This will be easier. I read it twice. There are some reports that look small in a system but large in the body. I saved the message to the correction file. Then I opened a wider audit request for all provisional reassessment pending records. The search returned more entries than I wanted and fewer than I feared. Some would be harmless, some would be old clerical knots. Some might be like this one, waiting in a quiet drawer while the present day walked around them. I marked the audit active, not urgent enough to frighten anyone, not mild enough to be ignored. That is a useful setting when one exists. The building lights entered their evening transition, though outside there was still daylight pressed against the glass. The amber strips along the lower floors deepened. The recovery pod corridor cooled. The shadow lanes became less like accommodations and more like the natural shape of the place. For vampires, evening is not always romance. Sometimes it is simply the part of the day when your shoulders stop preparing for harm. I took off my gloves and inspected the fingertips. The treated fabric was browned where the atrium reflection had caught it. Not ruined, just marked. I set them aside for repair and took a fresh pair from the drawer. The old Class 3 badge sleeve remained on my desk. I should have logged it immediately. Instead, I held it for a moment. It was a practical object. Plastic, matte, lightly scratched, with a clip that had been repaired at least once. It had probably been touched thousands of times before meetings, crossings, elevator rides, corridor waits, and recovery breaks that were optional only because the system had not known what the body knew. I placed it in an evidence envelope, not as a relic, as proof. The final sunlight line withdrew from the lower atrium floor on my monitor. The path that had been white earlier became gray, then blue, then nothing special at all. A cleaning worker pushed a cart across it without needing shade. The fountain kept moving. The trees stood in their planters, harmless again for a while. My badge rested cool against my coat. The corrected route map stayed blue. Old archives sent no further messages. That, too, was a kind of peace. I closed the blind control binder and set the portable shade panel back on its hook. The panel showed one pale scuff from the atrium, a thin mark where the reflected beam had touched its silvered side. It would still work. Most protective things carry marks if they are doing their job. Before I ended my shift, I walked the interior route once more. From my desk to old archives, from old archives to the recovery pods, from the recovery pods to windowless room 4. From windowless room 4 back through the service core. The route was longer than the atrium edge. It passed a storage closet, a low pipe, a wall where old paint showed through, and a vending machine that sold mineral tonic in cans no one liked, but everyone finished. It was not elegant. It was safe. At the door to old archives, the blue root light rested on the floor like a quiet ribbon. I stood there for a moment, listening to the soft machinery of the lower floors. Printers cooling, vents breathing, badges sleeping against coats. Somewhere behind the archive doors, the senior document handler was likely arranging old papers under lamps that did not hurt. Perhaps they were making notes for the audit. Perhaps they were only sitting still in the correct dark, letting easier become believable. I did not knock. The work had already reached them. I returned to my desk as the building settled toward evening. There would be other errors, other routes that looked safe from a distance, other forms with old words folded behind newer ones. A company does not become gentle all at once. It becomes less careless by increments if someone keeps reading the small amber flickers. That was my work. I watched the shadow routing map soften into its night configuration, all the lower paths blue and steady. Then I logged the correction, closed the archive file, and let the office become dim enough that no one had to be brave about the light. Marlowe here again. Some records from the night archives arrive with grand doors and strange weather. Others arrive in locked delivery cabinets, mislabeled folders, and a system that has mistaken endurance for consent. I find this one stays with me because its kindness is so practical. A route changed, a badge corrected, a room made dark enough for someone to stop pretending the day was easy. If there is a world you have wondered about, a place you have imagined, or a quiet corner of another universe you would like us to look into, you may leave it in the comments. Marlowe has a strange habit of gently opening doors we did not even know existed. Until next time, this has been Marlowe's Evening Radio. May the lights around you be gentle and may the night find you kindly.